So we're continuing the theme of creation that we started this morning. This morning was probably, in a sense, kind of a new one for you. It's a little bit of a new one for me in the sense of preaching it. It's kind of collecting different things that have been occurring or happening in my last few years and trying to make a talk out of it. So that's why it was a little bit disparate and whatnot. So next time it'll be smoother, I'm sure. But the idea that part of being created in God's image and likeness is the fact that God gave us authority, and that is something essential to us. He said, have dominion over all the stuff out there. It very poetically talks the fishes in the sea and the things that crawl and whatever. Bottom line, you have dominion over everything that is created. However, clearly it's not just a dominion of the tyrant, like we said. God never said, go out and trash the environment. Just take buckets of paint and pour them into the closest river and set up chemical plants and just... I lived in a country where they do those things. I lived in, third world country where the sense of, which is a pity because it was a tropical paradise, but the sense of taking care of the ecology. It's like when I was in the Philippines, one of the, talk about just boneheaded, short-term vision of things. How do you like this little dynamite fishing? You go and find where these pristine coral reefs, and if you want to, which may work, you might catch a lot of fish for a couple of years. Dynamite fishing. You just start dropping charges of dynamite into the coral reef and see what comes floating up. And then they wonder why 10 years later there's no fish left. And then they just move on to the next part. Well, we've destroyed this part. Let's move on. So it'll be somebody else's problem to worry about it. Or the other option was just cyanide fishing, which I don't know if it was cyanide or some poison, but they would dump something down there that heavier than water that would go down and just all the dead fish come. I mean, how would you like to eat that fish after that? The dynamite, presumably they're not going to try to sell you scraps of fish, but, just the shock wave, I guess, does enough damage to most of the fish that has come up wondering what the heck happened to them. And that's just one of the many examples. When I would do missions, again, this is just simple people. It's not that they're evil or anything, but just simple people. I would do missions on this one island, and we'd bring our rich, spoiled kids out onto the island of Tingloy. And it's an island that doesn't have much electricity. By not much, I mean there is a generator there, but it's not enough to power the whole island at the same time. So they go 18 on, 18 off. So one half of the island gets 18 straight of electricity, and the other half is in darkness, and then vice versa. And they do it that way, evidently, so that sometimes you get it in the morning, sometimes you get it in the evening, whatever. It's not just, you're not just stuck with like electricity from 7 in the evening to 7 in the morning when it hardly isn't any use to you, right? But even there, an island with no paved roads to speak of, kind of a perimeter trail in parts of the island where they laid down some slabs, but, no running water. There are wells, there are pumps and stuff, but nothing, just a bunch of coconut trees and pigs and chickens and fishing and whatever. And even there, the most natural thing in the world is the kids have a bottle of Coke because it's close to the mainland, so there are boats that go back and forth, so they do get their products, The most natural thing in the world, I've got a candy bar, the wrapper, right into this, wherever I am, just... Okay, I'm done with it. And I remember one time there's a garbage can. It was some old truck tire turned inside out, but they kind of flipped it into this bowl shaped thing that served as their garbage can. And I remember telling this guy, I was like, dude, there's a can right there. And he's just looking at me like I'm speaking to him in a foreign language, which I was, but he understood the concept. I'm like, what are you doing? Why is it too hard to walk 10 feet and throw it away? That's mentality, right? So that was not a tangent I intended to go on. The idea is that's not what dominion means, dominion over nature. That's fallen man, right? So what should our relationship with the created order be? The physical created order. This is the famous meditation of what St. Ignatius refers to as creatures. Now, when in the English language in modern times, when we think of creatures, you normally think of something cute and furry, right? Okay, for St. Ignatius, reality it's a very simple divide. It's kind of black and white. The reality is divided into two kinds of things: God and everything else. So if you're God, you're God, and if you're not God, you're created, therefore you're a creature. So creature in his language is created being, okay? Anything that's created. And St. Ignatius puts things very clearly. He says pretty much all of the created universe, everything, including angels, saints, and we'll go into what different kinds of creatures are, because I think sometimes we limit it just to physical objects. Any created thing whatsoever is good for us in as much as it helps us in our relationship with God. So, God, we know that in Genesis, when God created everything he created was good. And then he created us, and we were very good, right? But that was also in the context in which Adam and Eve were integrally and harmoniously functioning the way they were supposed to function. So in today's day and age, there are creatures out there, created things, that could be good for us in certain circumstances and maybe not so good in other circumstances. So we're going to kind of delve into that a little bit, okay? There are some kinds of creatures that are just intrinsically bad. A creature is any created thing. Well, let's start first of all into what kind of things fall into the category of creatures. The most obvious thing would be physical objects, right? The world. You step outside and you see nature, okay? And like we said in the first meditation, the whole created universe. Think about when I was in college, and I only dabbled in this because I only had like 2 years of college, and frankly, I wasn't particularly good at these classes. I was kicking around the idea of aeronautical engineering. I'm not particularly mathematically inclined, but the problem was in college, I was like, my strength was writing, but what the heck do you do with that? So I better get a meaningful degree just so I can actually make money and have a living, as opposed to writing, which might take off. So I was there dabbling in a couple semesters of some math classes and chemistry and stuff. But when you're studying chemistry, it tends to occupy itself with the microscopic, the subatomic, and in our universe, there are subatomic particles. I mean, atomic is already pretty small. You can't even see an atom because in order to, be able to visualize it, you have to bombard it with something like an electron or one of these particles that would shatter the atom, and in the process you break it so you can't see it. So you can only speculate. You can figure it out that it has to be there, and we've done a good job by reactions and everything, figuring out what's there. But then they've got these subatomic particles. When I was a kid, I remember quarks. That was supposed to be like, ooh, there are things that are even smaller than electrons and neutrons and protons. There are quarks. And now I don't even know how many they've figured out that must exist, but there's like a dozen of these subatomic, just minuscule things. And you think about the fact that God created the universe with that kind of complexity and attention to detail and everything as a gift to us. Apparently, for people who are smarter than I am, and this is actually part of how the atomic bomb works, in the end of the day, matter and energy are really the same reality. It's just matter just seems to be a crystallized form of energy, which is why in an atomic explosion, there's the famous law of conservation of matter, that you can have a chemical reaction, but if you were to do it in a completely contained space, there's always the same amount of matter. So you can light wood on fire, but nonetheless, at the end of the day, if you collect all the smoke and the ash and everything that's emitted from that pile of wood, you've got the same amount of stuff, right? It's just it's a release of energy bonds from a higher level containing more energy to a lower level stuff. However, in an atomic explosion, you actually end up with less matter, not just the fact that the matter around you happens to be leveled, but you actually end up with less matter. There's actually a pure conversion of material into energy, which means that, it means that God is really smart. And we live in this really, just like God, our universe is simultaneously very complex and very simple. Because at the end of the day, it seems like everything reduces down to energy at the final analysis. And so how simple, and then nonetheless how complicated, right? But all of this is God's gift to us. And like we said this morning earlier, to the furthest extent of all the stuff that the Webb and the Hubble and all these telescopes can, are picking up that are just trillions of light years, and who knows how long these things have been out there. And all of this was created for us. And if you think I'm lying, this number that you've got in the Catechism says the same thing. The universe, created in and by the eternal Word, the image of the invisible God, is destined for and addressed to man, himself in the image of God. Later on it says, for God willed creation as a gift addressed to man, an inheritance destined for and entrusted to him. All of this physical universe, only because God one day wanted to make us. Okay? So already, right off the bat then, physical reality is a gift. And if you despise a gift that is given to you, then you're disrespecting the person. If your wife does something really nice for you, I don't know, it's your birthday and she goes and creates, some secret endeavor and goes out of her way and kills herself to cook the meal that you particularly love and sets up everything, and you come home, oh, no thanks, I'm just going to watch TV and go to bed. It's like, she will take some offense. And that foolhardy mistake of yours will haunt you for a long time. You're not getting out of that one too easy. Why? You've offended her, and rightly so. She put her heart into giving you a gift, and you're just like, yeah, thanks. Your kids do that to you all the time, or at least they used to when they were young and ungrateful. Hopefully by now they're a little older and more mature, right? Other kinds of creatures, though, aside from the physical universe. Again, anything that's created is a creature. Your thoughts are creatures. Why? Because they're not God. Therefore, you can conceive of them. That's one of the only things you can actually create all by yourself, are thoughts, right? Your imagination, your memory, all your interior world, okay, those things are creatures. They can either be good for you or bad for you. And we can govern. And actually, the vast percentage of our spiritual life comes down to, really all of it, at the end of the day, comes down to what's happening on the inside of your skin. Jesus himself says it's not what goes into a man that makes him unclean, right? Because he was talking about the Jewish purity rituals. It's not what comes out of it, but what comes out of him. And he's not talking about biological here. He's saying what comes out is going to be, your thoughts, your fornication, your bad language, your bad temper, your whatever. Okay? Because he says that's what's coming out from your interior world and expressing itself in the world. And how often do our sins stem from the fact that somewhere along the line we see something like the apple in the Garden of Eden, or the fruit, we never know if it's an apple. When I was in the Philippines, I used to tell them it was a mango, because they don't have apples over there. And if they do, they import them, but they don't naturally have too many apples. How many of our problems stem from when we see, or some idea just strikes us, or we see something and we start wrestling with the temptation on the interior world, and you have a choice in that moment. Reject it because I know it's bad, or because it's attractive, start playing games and then start going down the slippery slope. And it bears fruit in sin, as St. James would tell you. Other things that are creatures, your spouse and your children. They're creatures. They're created by God. Therefore, they can be quote-unquote used. Now, I'm going to use that word gingerly because human beings are not meant to be used, but we are meant to be always objects for our own sake and not meant to be used. It's precisely when we start quote-unquote using them that we're treating them badly and we're sinning. They can be, I guess, quote-unquote used in the sense that the person that I love as an object of my love. When I properly order my love towards that person, I am working out my own sanctification. I'm not doing it selfishly, but the side benefit is that I am the first beneficiary every time that I deal with people in a proper way. And I love them. The way God made us is that whole paradox of precisely by dying to yourself, forgetting about yourself, and not really making it about yourself, that is the best thing you can possibly do for yourself. The minute you start getting selfish and thinking too much about what am I getting out of the deal, you're probably losing out. So that's the whole paradox of the spiritual life, right? But your wife and children, for example, are creatures, and your friendships and your relationships, your job, your career, your goals, your hobbies, all these things are creatures in the end of the day. And therefore, every one of these things, there are some things that are just intrinsically bad. Sin, for example. Most things in the world are indifferent, and it just depends on context, and it depends on me. And then there are some things that, by their nature, are good. Sanctifying grace is a creature, always good. It's never a bad thing to, in a sense, be greedy for sanctifying grace, because that's your union with God. That's what you were made for. However, it's funny the way that we can address these things, because, for example, the sacraments in the church are creatures. Okay? And sometimes we can abuse them. The church is always going to be a good force. It's never going to be a bad thing being attached to the church if we properly understand the church. Not just, the bishops and the institutions and the buildings and everything, but truly to understand it as the mystical body of Christ, of which I am a living member. That's always going to be a good thing. But the sacraments, for example, can you become attached to a sacrament and can God allow you to be stripped of a sacrament and it might not be a bad thing? Walter Chiswick, we're going to hear, went decades without really having access to the sacraments. God, in an ideal world, no, he would have never voluntarily done that. If he had the choice, then he would have fled to the sacraments any chance he got. And that's the proper disposition. But if God chooses to strip you of it, he can make you holy without the sacraments, and he did. He stripped him, and it became a penance and a cross to him, the fact that he didn't have access to all the things that you and I take so for granted, right? So every one of these creatures that is out there, it exists. It is good for me to the extent that it helps me to grow in my love and knowledge of God. The minute that any creature out there becomes an obstacle to my growing in the knowledge and love of God, which happens through selfishness. Every sin reduces down to some form of selfishness or not, or one way or another. So when I reach my hand out in a greedy or possessive way, and this is again related to our sense of what is our proper understanding of having dominion over creation, right? When I reach out and try to grasp it possessively or greedily or selfishly, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, for example, which in and of itself was a good thing, but when they grasped for it as opposed to receiving it as a gift, then it became an evil for Adam and Eve. When I do that, then that creature becomes for me an evil. So I think a lot of the creatures in our lives, the things that are in our lives, are goods under the right circumstances. Let's take, for example, friendships. Okay? Can you ever be too good a friend of somebody in the sense of a healthy friendship? No. Because that is a form of love. Love of God and love of neighbor. Your entire faith comes down to love of God and love of neighbor. So you can never be too good a friend. However, Can you spend too much time? If you're married and have kids, for example, can you spend too much time? Sure. Can that friendship become, if you're not careful, can certain friendships develop into dependencies, which already is a corruption of true authentic friendship? Yes. If I find that I have a friendship and that friendship is turning into a dependency for me, a dependency in the sense that if I don't have that exposure to this person, then problems start popping up. Then you have to take a serious look at it. There is a corruption in there. It doesn't mean you're too good a friend. Actually, the best thing you can do in that sense is moderate for the sake of the friendship and make sure that it doesn't become kind of codependency. This is more going to be the case between friendships between men and women as it is probably between guys, but it could be, in a sense, lifelong friend, and you've been doing things and then you meet your wife, and obviously that's always one of those big challenges, is depending on who you marry and what the circumstances are and who your friends were and what your past life was, sometimes that can be a problem. Wives don't always appreciate lifelong buddies, and then it's like, well, wait a minute, this is my friend, what are you talking about? I can't just dump. And vice versa. The same, we can do the same thing to them. So for something to be good or bad for us, the number one thing we need to look at is, how does this affect my heart? How does this affect what's happening on the inside? So one telltale sign, like we mentioned, are going to be attachments. In today's day and age, attachments have always been an issue, but in today's day and age, technologically, we have all kinds of dangers of attachments. This little gadget, and I'm not immune to it. I actually, not too long ago, I remember it was kind of nighttime, because I tend to work with my phone and tend to also listen to books and look at stuff and read sports and do whatever in free times. But I remember noticing towards the beginning of Lent, it was after night prayers, supposed to go to bed. I didn't have any legitimate reason to be, not like I had some job of, great importance that I couldn't have waited till the morning. But I kind of found the itch, like I felt like scrolling, just whatever. And I didn't even have any particular object I wanted to scroll. Usually I end up going to like sports or something. And I realized, okay, well, clearly throughout the days I've been spending too much time here. And what happens is, even chemically, there are, I'm sure you've read about it by now, but you get the little dopamine kick every time you hear the bell and you feel important and all that. Even biochemically, this gadget starts creating attachments, and the people who design them know that. Interestingly enough, a lot of the tech guys, the main tech guys, don't let their kids have regular access to cell phones and tablets and stuff until they're like in high school. The guys who actually make the stuff. The dummies would give your 3-year-old and your kids to play games while you're in the laundromat, and your kids are getting, attached to games at an early age and everything. So this can become a real attachment. Whatever limits your your freedom and your capacity to give God an unadulterated yes, no matter what God asks of you, it is an attachment. And it can be a good thing in and of itself. I would say the most dangerous thing that we have are our human relationships. The more you love a person, and again, authentic love, true, godly love, will foster the life of grace and therefore enable us to give God a greater yes. However, the more you love a person, the more there could be the attraction, the more weight they could have on you to be willing to give God a no sometimes. If it comes down to the person that I love or God's will, that's not always an easy choice, right? And as parents, for example, how often do I see, or hear, I should say, in confession, Father, I don't go to Mass regularly. Well, why? Well, my daughter's got soccer games, and my other daughter's got ballet, and my son plays hockey. And, season, and probably 6 months out of the year that one of them is doing something or other. So 6 months out of the year, you're telling me you hardly ever go to Mass because of sports. And when you all die and face God, what will have seemed important to you then? Your kid's not even that good. None of your kids is going to make a living doing this. Probably none of them are going to go to college and do it. Okay, so it's a nice pastime. But what are we training? We're training our kids in that moment. God is nice and everything if you've got nothing else better to do. But really, the most important thing is this creature. And again, I played sports. I played 8 years of football. Not any good, but played 8 years of it. The only reason I didn't play 9 was because of my academic excellence one year. My mom decided I needed a little break in order to reorder my priorities, which probably, in hindsight, I'm grateful she did it. At the time, I didn't really love the decision, but so there's a very simple example. Classic example for us guys is our work. How many of us allow our work to become, it's not that we're evil again, it's a lot of times that society in general is making it difficult for us not to go there, right? If you have one of those jobs where you're kind of being pressured, especially if you have a high executive job in some of these corporations, the expectation is 80 hours a week. If you're actually going to get done the stuff that you're going to get done, okay, if you're working 80 hours a week, can it be done? Yes. But it makes it rough to live your faith well. I only knew one guy that I'm aware of that lived that lifestyle and seemed to come out really well. There's a guy, this is back in the early 2000s. He had been president of Delta Faucet, and there's a company, I don't know, you probably never even heard of Masco. Masco is an umbrella that owns lots of other companies. At the time, they owned about 80 different companies. You would know the names of many of the companies: Delta Faucet, Anderson Windows. So at the time, at least 70% of what you would find in the Home Depot was a Masco company. He was one of these 8 hours a week guys. He said sometimes, especially as a younger guy, I would show up to the office on Tuesday with a duffel bag and I wouldn't leave until Thursday sometime, when he was doing his thing. He was the only one of those guys I knew where his kids didn't have drug problems and he was on his 3rd trophy wife and, disaster, but he made a lot of money. He was still married to the girl that he fell in love with in college, and his kids all came out and his kids went to Mass and they had a beautiful family, and I said, the guy's name was Ray. I said, Ray, how did you do it? And he said, he pulled out this, those cheap string glow-in-the-dark rosaries that look green when they turn out the lights? He pulled out this beat-up old, $1 glow-in-the-dark rosary that he probably had since he was a kid. And he said, well, look, in between meetings, I got 5 minutes here or there. I'll be praying that. Like I said, he's the only man I know that did that. Probably in Lumen there's some other guys that are similar, but I don't know them. I don't know their stories. We have the gospel passage down below. It will be as a man going on a journey, he called his servants and entrusted to them his property. One he gave 5 talents, another 2, another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. You know the story of the parable of the talents. All you old school Regnum Christi guys, this used to be classic meditation material, time and eternity. It's still a totally valid meditation. It's still a totally valid part of our spirituality. And we'll get there a little later. I don't want to focus so much on the time and eternity, maximizing the use of the talents and everything, which is kind of the gist of this gospel passage. God is saying, I gave you all this stuff. How did you use it? Okay? I want to focus on really from this perspective, and you can just try to take this to your meditation. I'll give you a little bit of time. From this perspective, God has given you an entire world, including your relationships, including the church and the sacraments and all that stuff. And he will ask you, What have you done with all the things how did you use the time and the talents and the treasures and everything you've got, your charm and good looks of which you all abound? How did you use all that stuff to build my kingdom, to grow holy? But I think right now from this meditation, let's look inwardly and say, how did you use the gifts that I gave you to grow in love? Did they become a distraction to you? Did they become competition to me? Or did every one of the gifts that I gave you become a channel to recognize the giver? Every gift God has given is an opportunity to recognize this came from a loving Father. This came from a giver. Gratuitously, I didn't deserve any of this. We all think we deserve our good health, for example. You don't deserve a bit of good health. What did you do to earn it? You don't deserve to even exist. None of us asked for it. Everything we have is a gift. And God has given us each, everybody in this room, except for myself, has probably got 60 years or more of life. I don't know about you. 60 years or more of life that they can look back and thank God. Everyone at least 50. I'm 52, and I'm probably the baby in the group, I think. Maybe. All right, there you go. So, co-babies. The rest of you old-timers, we've got at least 52 years of life to look back on and say, okay, does my existence constantly, am I in an attitude of recognition, of gratitude? Do I use everything to kind of redound back to the relationship with the Creator? Because that's what He gave it to us for. He gave us all of our existence so that we could grow in our knowledge and love of Him.